Good afternoon, everybody. My name again is Aaron Mason. Today we're going to be going over our lesson about Native American perspectives and what was going on with Native American tribes during the westward expansion of the 19th century. All right. So today's lesson is going to cover the Lakota over. Normally, what we tend to only see in textbooks is just the perspective of American settlers kind of going forward in this manifest destiny sense of going out into the west and settling the west. But like one of the biggest parts of western expansion was this clash of cultures and perspectives from what was, if you really imagine it in perspective, in how this perspective was, is there was almost a whole different country that was split up into very small little segments of tribes, bands, clans, and so on and so forth all over the West. And the United States at the time, up when we started passing the Mississippi, was just this almost blob, like the movie The Blob, just pushing forward and just consuming and taking up as much as they could and trying to absorb and assimilate everything that came in. And if it didn't, they ended up fighting over it. So, but understanding the perspective of the Lakota is very important. Now, you may ask, like, what's in it for me and why we're going over this lesson. So, specifically, we're going to be talking about James Walker. I have his book up front, about a few copies. So, if you want to read it, that's perfectly fine. You can just return it to me. We're going to analyze James Walker's specific events and the connections made, understand the idea behind his interviews, be able to explain, the perspectives along the time among different populations, compare the diverse cultures of Native Americans using James Walker's account, and then show how the physical environment cultural contributed to the characteristics of the Oglala Lakota and the overall Nakota, Lakota, and Dakota tribes. Right. So you've heard this name a couple times from me already. Who is James Walker? So James Walker was an anthropologist. So he studied human beings, like the history, the makeup of them, like their culture, their society, for the American Museum of Natural History in New York. Right. From 1896 to 1914, he was embedded at the Pine Ridge Reservation, and he took interviews, he recorded data, he took pictures, he did everything to kind of like collect all this information on who the Oglala Lakota were, so that it could be saved and it can be taught to other people across the United States. He wrote 3 volumes of cultures, took pictures of the Oglala Lakota over at Pine Ridge. And this was all like pretty much right at the end of the Great Sioux War. And this was pretty much when they were finally settled onto the reservation. So it was the last attempt to kind of grasp what was left of the nomadic experience and what the Lakota were before, they were pretty much put on these reservations. What was important about it? And like I was talking about, this is a comprehensive look of the Lakota, Nakota, and Dakota. So now, while it is just the Oglala Lakota, you can generally assume that the vast majority of Lakota, Nakota, and Dakota were probably very similar to this before the near cultural eradication, as we've seen, in the news in recent times, that we've had. They've uncovered, mass graves from the native schools up in Canada and the United States. But what James Walker did is a perfect example of geographers and historians and anthropologists studying human beings and trying to capture what at that point in time, what was for them and who they were. All right, this also gives us historical and cultural perspectives of this people, and even now we're doing this with everybody. All right. So before we read your text, which I have stapled copies up at the front, you're going to take these. I want you to kind of just talk amongst your group. You have about 5-10 minutes, kind of come up with simple organization charts, some brief notes on how your family structured, how your community structured. Is there a hierarchy to community? And discuss this quietly with your group. All right. This will come important towards the end of the day and with the assignment itself. All right. Ask yourself with like how your society is organized. Now, it might be a small family society. It might extend, maybe with cousins and grandparents, or it might be, your neighbors, or you might just be out in the middle of nowhere and it's just your family and that's it. So, and then kind of discuss like what makes you the same, what makes you different, and we'll go from there. All right, now that you've already had the time to do all that, while you read, I want you to take notes on the similarities you find within the group and the society structures that are presented by James Walker. Recall previous Native American tribes from other units, the Iroquois with Powhatan, the Seminoles, and so on and so forth, and make comparison and contrast with with a new Native American tribe. And then kind of see how the Ogallala Lakota society differed from the perspectives of European Americans of the time. All right, now that you're all completed reading, this is your assignment. It's not due today. You definitely can work on it today. We're going to kind of give you some more time tomorrow to work on it. You have to write a letter. All right, you can work in a group to kind of organize and like talk about like what James Walker was talking about. But the idea is that you are the James Walker's assistant, straight from the American Museum of Natural History in New York, around the turn of almost to the point of the turn of the 20th century. All right, you're embedded with the Ogallala Lakota tribe, and in the lull of your activities, you ask if you can be present in one of the interviews with Mr. Walker and a member of the tribe. All right, the 10-page part of the book that you're doing is the interview that you are a part of, that you kind of collect information on. All right, knowing that you're going to get a letter out, that the courier who's going to like be able to take mail back east, you want to write a letter to your family and kind of like translate what you learned in this interview time so that they can understand it. All right, so you can take your family might be in New York, might be in Washington, D.C., or wherever they are, but they would kind of have a basic understanding of the Native Americans of that area, or maybe, some of the stuff that's closer to them, but they might not know as much about the West, the nomadic, or the Lakota, or the other Native American tribes that are way out here. And so you want them to understand who they are because you find it interesting, all right? Use your pre-reading notes about your community and your family hierarchy. That should be used in your assignment so that you can kind of translate certain positions, or maybe in your family or in your community that would work that way. Like I said, you can definitely work in your assigned groups, but everyone will turn in their own letter. All right, for those of you that want to go above and beyond, or maybe writing a letter, like a huge letter would be just a little too much, there are, like I said, there are copies of the book up front. James Walker talks about so much more than just the society structure. He talks about art, he talks about culture, he talks about horses, he talks about war, he talks about so much. You can find some of the stuff in here and make that same letter in a different form, like towards a different subject, if that's what you want to do. I'm not saying you have to do it that way, but everyone, like, you all have the basic thing. You can take the book from me, and if there's more than one, you're definitely welcome to do that. If trying to describe, the organizational structure of the Lakota, or the Lakota, Ogallala, the Ogallala Lakota, and your families, you are more than welcome to create a chart or a drawing or a poster instead of doing and just writing it all out. All right. You are expected to at least write something, where you're explaining the context of, the comparisons and whatnot. But if you wanted to do a drawing, you're more than welcome to. All right, this is how you're going to be graded. So you're going to be graded on how well you analyze the American perspectives of the period, describing cultural differences and making comparisons, explaining the physical environment and culture and how it contributed to the characteristics of the Ogallala Lakota, make connections to the idea and the events of the text, analyze the text into central idea and develop, and write your letter to inform or narrate an experience. If there are no questions for me, I'll be walking around to make sure that we understand what's going on. If you have questions, or you want to know more about this, by all means.